Millions of years ago, the North American landscape began its transition to its modern-day look with the spreading of the grasslands in the western United States. These grasslands caused animals to adapt and change to the new environment. But in some places, the grasslands had yet to take over. The Gray Fossil Site in Gray, Tennessee was a safe haven for creatures that were suited for the forested environment that remained in the area. From 7 to 4.5 million years ago, many creatures called Gray home. These species were quite different from the modern-day animals that are found in East Tennessee. Many of the animals found at Gray are of great significance to the scientific community. 3 animals in particular, the red panda, the rhino, and the giant ground sloth, are some of the more interesting characters of the time.
You know, our site really is known for the, quote, red panda. I mean, we're one of the few sites that actually has it. I mean, red pandas were sort of widespread around the northern hemisphere at one time, but most of the sites are just fragments and bits and pieces of teeth, and, you know, not a whole lot, whereas here we have lots of individuals, but it wasn't always that way. You know, the first specimen that we actually recognized as panda was something that Larry Bristol found, and it was an upper molar. And when we started, that's all we had to work with was that upper molar, but there were enough characters that we could identify it as a red panda and that it was different enough to call it a new species. But then years later, we found a jaw, and then eventually we found part of a skeleton, and then another skeleton, and it's really picked up. So we went from, you know, having a single tooth to actually having multiple fairly complete skeletons. So we can say a lot more about the animal. We can compare it to the living red panda. And what's neat is that there's lots of neat things about it, but one of the neat aspects is that when you look at the teeth of our fossil red panda and compare them to living red pandas, they actually have a lot of characters that suggest they ate a higher percentage of meat. So instead of just being a bamboo eater like the living red panda, this is actually something that probably preyed a lot more on, you know, small vertebrates, you know, rodents, you know, chasing a squirrel up in a tree or whatever, stealing bird eggs, you know, eating a lot more meat, or at least a higher percentage. But what's kind of cool to think about is the fact that it's quite a bit larger than the living red panda. Ours actually exhibits sexual dimorphism, where the males and females are different sizes, and the female looks like it's about twice the size of the living red panda, whereas the male is probably 3 times the size. And what's neat is they have semi-retractable recurved claws, a lot like a cat. So in what you can kind of envision is this sort of Wolverine-size animal running around with these retractable claws like a cat, and then of course eating a higher percentage of meat. It's actually out catching it, which is kind of neat to think about. So very different than your typical red panda that just climbs up a tree, you know, eats bamboo, which you really don't have to chase. You know, ours would have been quite a bit different, quite a bit larger and quite a bit more aggressive, which is kind of neat to think about. And it is becoming a fairly common animal at our site. Originally we just had bits and pieces, but now it's becoming something that we find, now that we have skeletons and we can identify even little fragments, we're recognizing that it's turning up all over this site. It's becoming somewhat common. So I think the sort of the analogy that I like to use is think of a raccoon today. It was probably filling a similar role, but just like raccoons, if you've got one, you've got a bunch of them. They're probably pretty common. And so it sort of is this, you know, sort of a red panda filling the raccoon role, which is kind of neat. I think that there's a good possibility that this was really a dense forest animal, and that essentially as the grasslands were spreading everywhere else and the forests were shrinking, this was sort of that last place that it could hold on. And I think if you could find other forested localities, you know, fossil localities that had that same sort of dense forest, you know, fauna, maybe we would find pandas. But that's assuming, you know, I don't know for sure that they were spread all over North America at one time, or whether maybe they were restricted to the southeast, or maybe they were some sort of Appalachian, you know, endemic, which is possible. And if that's the case, then we may be the only site until we can find another similar age site in the Appalachians, or maybe up into Canada or someplace like that. You know, until we find another site that's the same age and preserves a dense forest, we may not find others. Usually red pandas are known from scraps. It's kind of neat that ours is actually known from whole skeletons, so we can say a lot more about it. In fact, in North America, there's only one other specimen. It's a single tooth from Washington, and when I say specimen, one other, quote, fossil red panda. It's quite a bit more advanced than ours. It looks like it's probably more strictly herbivorous, like the living red panda. It has a very complex tooth, but they've never found anything else. It's just that one tooth. So within North America, or even just the New World in general, I mean, this is the only site that has, red panda worth really looking at aside from that single tooth up in Washington, which is kind of cool. The rhino was one of the first, sort of indicators. We often talk about, well, the alligator told us that it wasn't Pleistocene, or, various finds told us that the site was a certain age. The rhino was really one of the first things that pushed the site back to, instead of being thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, the rhino pushed it back to millions of years, because rhinos went extinct in North America 4.5 million years ago. And when we started finding teeth and other fragments at the site, we're like, okay, this is a rhino. It looks like it's maybe Teleoceras. Teleoceras has a very distinct body plan. It's built like a big wiener dog, or sort of like a hippo. So when you see the bones, they're pretty distinctive, and you recognize right away that, okay, this is not only rhino, but it's a weird rhino, and it's probably Teleoceras. So fairly early on, we recognized that. And we started running into bits and pieces kind of all over the site. But back in 2004, we actually hit an articulated skeleton. And when I say articulated, I just mean all the bones were in place where they're supposed to be. It looked like it just laid there and died. And we found a whole skeleton, and then next to it we found another one. And since that time, of course, we found bits and pieces of many others. And it was pretty neat, because as we put it together, we said, yeah, this is Teleoceras. It does have that weird body plan, that sort of wiener dog body plan. But its legs are a little too long for what we expected. And even when we started looking at the teeth looked a little different. So right away, we started recognizing that, yes, it is Teleoceras, but maybe it's a different kind of Teleoceras. And that's sort of where we are today, is we're in the process of saying, we think this is new, and here's all the reasons why we think it's new, a new species to science. And so we're trying to describe it right now. There's a variety of characters that make our Teleoceras look really different. If I could start with sort of how does it look the same, one of the things that Teleoceras is known for is, of course, the stubby legs, but the feet, the hands and feet have bones that are really compressed. So instead of their fingers being long bones like ours, they're like stacks of pancakes. They're really flattened. And ours has all those classic characters. When you look at the lower tusks and upper tusks and how they interact, ours has those classic characters. It has the things that define the genus. But in terms of how is it different than other species of Teleoceras, ours has long legs for some reason. It's a taller rhino, or at least relatively compared to other Teleoceras. It's still short compared to living rhinos, but it's taller than normal Teleoceras. It also has differences in the teeth, very minor differences in the complexity of the teeth, sort of in their general proportions and shape relative to the skull and relative to each other. So it has just a kind of a neat suite of characters that say, yes, it is Teleoceras, but it's different than all the other ones that have been described. One of the other things that's really cool is that Teleoceras, at almost every other fossil locality that we find it, it's usually associated with more open habitats. They're usually considered grazers. They're out there eating the grass. And even when you test the isotopes in the teeth, and when you look at other features, they've even found phytoliths in the teeth that show that, yes, it does eat grass everywhere else. But for whatever reason, when we tested ours, it came back as a browser, which was really interesting, which means it's eating leafy vegetation and things like that. So it's kind of cool because, the fact that it looks different in terms of some of its body proportions and its teeth, might have something to do with the fact that it's also eating slightly different things and living in a forested environment. So it's kind of a neat rhino in the sense that it's not the rhino we expected. There are other forest rhinos that should be here that we haven't found yet, which is kind of surprising. I mean, there are things like aphalops. I would expect to find that here, and we haven't found it yet. What's nice about Teleoceras is it's a very widespread rhino. So we have lots of other localities that we can compare ours to. During the late Miocene, even the middle Miocene, it was spread pretty much all over North America. So I can go to California and see Teleoceras. I can go to Nebraska and see Teleoceras. I can go to Florida and see Teleoceras. So we have lots of good collections with lots of skeletons that we can compare ours to. And one in particular is the Ashfall site in central Nebraska. They have literally hundreds of skeletons that they've collected from that one site. And so you can take ours and compare it and say, yeah, it is Teleoceras, but boy, it sure is different than the other ones that have been described. Normally, if you were to put a teleoceras next to a modern rhino, you'd probably start laughing first because it's so short and so stubby looking. And the typical weights that people would think of for a modern rhino, if you think of like the Asian rhino, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 pounds. If you get to a white or a black rhino, maybe now you're talking 6,000 or 7,000 pounds. Teleoceras is typically estimated to be about 1,500 pounds, so quite a bit smaller. If I were going to put an estimate on ours, the one we have here from Gray, I would say it's probably closer to 2,500 pounds. So it's big for teleoceras, it's tall for teleoceras, but it's still a small rhino compared to what a person would think of in their head when they think of rhino. They'd say, well, that's big, but it's not very big. It's not as big as you'd expect. This particular rhino is actually one of my favorites. We dug this out in 2004. It took us about 9 weeks to dig out the entire skeleton. And when I say entire skeleton, I mean we literally have every single bone except for one toe bone. So this is by far the most complete rhino in eastern North America, and maybe even one of the most complete in North America in general. But it was kind of cool for me when they were putting it together because, when I was digging, I would only see 1 or 2 bones at a time. Even when we laid it out on a table, it really didn't do the animal justice. And so when they started mounting it, and I was working with the people doing the mount, it was kind of fun to be able to go and see it come together like this. It was like you're building a skeleton from scratch. It was like this giant jigsaw puzzle, and it was a lot of fun to see it go together and to come up with the pose and make sure everything was anatomical before it was finished. But now is when I really appreciate it. I really like to see it standing there because instead of just being a couple of bones in the field, it's now actually an animal standing in front of me, so I love it. I always like to tell the story of it's a small giant ground sloth, and I always laugh and say it sounds like an oxymoron, but in reality it kind of is. We have a femur, which is sort of your upper thigh bone. We have a few hand and foot bones. We have some tail bones. We have enough that we can tell you, yes, it is a giant ground sloth. It's most likely a megalithid giant ground sloth, and it's fairly small. I mean, like I said, it's probably 6 feet tall, maybe. The femur's like literally this high. I say 6 feet, probably closer to 5 feet tall, so sort of like a big bear. But in the past there have been much, much larger ground sloths. Eurymetherium from the Caribbean, it's more recently been found in Florida. They have a mounted specimen in Gainesville that's 18 feet tall. That's a giant ground sloth. And so I always like to say that ours is a small giant ground sloth. We don't have enough characters to say for sure who it is, but we can definitely say it's a sloth. And to me, I think that in itself is pretty cool to think we have a sloth roaming around that's kind of a small giant ground sloth, and then we have these small little tapirs, but then we also have this giant elephant thing. And so we've got this kind of neat mixture of small animals and big animals that are reminiscent of other sites, but they're different in their own way. The thing that you always have to remember is that we've only dug between 1% and 2% of the site. And as we dig down into the material that is what we call in situ, still in place, we tend to find articulated animals. When we're up in the bulldozer zone, they're all scattered, but when we get down into the in situ material, we tend to find these nice articulated skeletons. And 90% of the time, it's taper, 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 taper. Occasional rhino, occasional, alligator. But sooner or later, we will hit a sloth, and then we'll know exactly who we have. And I think that's kind of what's fun about the site in general, is that we have all these teases. All these animals that we have bits and pieces of, so we know they're there, we just aren't sure who. And so I feel like every year that we dig, we have that possibility of finding another skeleton and figuring out, okay, who is this? What camel do we have, or camels do we have? Because we'll find one of those laid out. The sloth thing is the same way, that sooner or later we'll hit one that's articulated and we'll know who it is then.
Scientists will be uncovering the rich history of the Gray Fossil Site for years to come.